Hi, I'm Evette Alexander, Director of Learning and Impact at the Knight Foundation. At the core of our work is our mission to foster both informed and engaged communities, which we believe are the bedrock of a healthy and representative democracy. A truly representative democracy is just that, one defined by the broad and representative participation of its people. Voting is our most fundamental form of democratic engagement, yet it's well established that those who come most often to the polls tend to be more affluent, more college educated, and whiter than the electorate at large. Knight Foundation's 100 Million Project was a study released in February 2020, a 14,000 person survey that explored barriers to participating in elections from the perspective of both our most active and our most disengaged voters. But it captured something that, in hindsight, was quite timely: a snapshot of voter sentiment about the legitimacy of our elections before the pandemic struck. Findings showed that many voters, even those who vote regularly, suffer from a lack of faith in the election system. Our survey found that nationally, before the pandemic, about 38% of disengaged voters said they were not confident that elections represent the will of the people. That figure dropped only 4% even for active voters, over a third of which still said they doubt the elections represent the will of the people. When asked why, the top reason given by disengaged or infrequent voters was that the system was in some way rigged or corrupt. The doubtful frequent voters were more likely to cite issues with the Electoral College or the idea that the popular vote doesn't elect the president. About half of respondents, both the disengaged and engaged voters, said they preferred that the Electoral College be abolished. When it came to confidence that the results of the elections are counted fully and accurately, only 21% of disengaged voters and 27% of frequent voters were very confident. This means that there were significant cracks in the foundations of public trust in our elections that 2020 served to split wide open. It's not surprising that we saw widespread doubt about the election results' legitimacy, and that now we are well aware of the challenge moving forward for how to build trust in this basic institution. In bringing to life concerns the public had about our election system predating the pandemic, which will likely endure in a post-pandemic world, we hope these insights can support new ways to energize a new generation of engaged citizens in the service of our democracy. And now, stay tuned for a conversation with folks on the front lines of ensuring elections are counted fully and accurately.
Thanks so much for joining us. I am David Becker. I'm the Executive Director and founder of the nonpartisan nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research in Washington, D.C. And I get to work with election officials all over the country and across the political spectrum to make sure our elections are as successful as they possibly can be. And I'm joined today by two good friends and two of the best election officials in the country who helped ensure that this past election cycle was the most accessible, secure, transparent, successful election that we've ever held in American history, despite tremendous challenges, and we'll get to some of those. I'm very glad to be joined by Secretary Jocelyn Benson of Michigan and Secretary Brad Raffensperger of Georgia. And as we get started, Jocelyn, I'll start with you, and Brad, you can answer this after Jocelyn's done. We talk a lot about, we've lived in this COVID world for a long time, and we've lived through all of the disinformation about the election and everything else that's happened. But it seems like decades ago, before the pandemic, when we were actually planning for the 2020 election cycle and what we thought was going to be record turnout, which did happen. Can you set the stage and tell us a little bit about what was going on in your states back maybe in, up to January, February of 2020, or even the Michigan primary in March, so that we can kind of remember how our world's changed and how that affected elections?
Well, yeah, and it's great to be here with Brad and you, and because I worked closely with both of you, frankly, in different ways throughout 2019 and in early 2020 to really just prepare for what we already knew was going to be an incredibly heavily scrutinized, high turnout election cycle. And in Michigan, we were in a unique place because in 2018, voters voted overwhelmingly to amend our state constitution to create new rights for citizens that would be in place for the first time in those 2020 elections. And those rights included the right to vote absentee without having to state a reason, or in other words, the right to vote from home, and also the right to be registered to vote automatically when you get a driver's license or state ID if you're eligible to vote, and also the right to register to vote up to and on election day itself. And so there were a number of things we were implementing, preparing to implement, and preparing for voters to be able to take advantage of for the first time. And we did that by, and this is important because it set the stage for how we quickly adjusted and adapted to the new normal. We did that by bringing experts to the table. We convened an election administration task force that included Matt Masterson and federal experts on election security. And you, David, were the co-chair of that task force, bringing in your expertise through Eric and other organizations you've worked with and led and background that you've had. And we brought in clerks and others and just brought experts to the table to advise us on how to best implement all these changes, which serendipitously prepared us to really just up the ante and the sense of urgency once the pandemic hit, and we had to take new factors into consideration, but we were already in a position of doing new things and listening to experts as we did them.
Yeah. And Brad, your state was already doing some of the things that Jocelyn was working to implement in Michigan, but you had some other big new things that you were trying to get in place in Georgia in advance of the presidential election, even before the pandemic hit.
Our big issue was getting our new voting system with a verifiable paper ballot. First time in 18 years, we have an election with a verifiable paper ballot. We had the old DRE machines, electronic voting, and we had to do a statewide implementation, all 159 counties. And we had to get that in place for the presidential primary. That was really, a federal judge was insisting no more DREs and get it done. So we had it all ready and we were good to go. Our presidential primary, I believe, trailed Michigan's by a week or so, and they pulled theirs off. But we were in our 3-week process in about a week and a half. And each day we're getting calls from the county election officials. Well, we have more and more poll workers that have called in sick today. They're not coming in because of COVID. And so we then had to do a shift, and we postponed the presidential primary. But because of our new system we said, those of you that have voted, we've secured your vote. And those of you that haven't voted, we'll add that to the June primaries that we're going to have. And that's when we'll pick that up. And that was one of the big issues that we were working on. But also, it's interesting, back in January, February, I was saying to everyone that I understand that we live in these contentious times. At the end of the day, I know that half the people will be happy with the results and half the people will be sad. But we want 100% of the people to have confidence in the results. And the one thing that did eventually give people more confidence in the result, I know that my party is still struggling with the results, but when we could actually have a physical paper ballot to recount. And so that really proved at the end of the day, it really stood up to why you have a verifiable paper ballot. But voting in the pandemic changed our election overnight.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, it seems so obvious in some ways, but honestly, Georgia's shift to paper ballots was so important in this election. And one of the challenges there, most people don't know this about how elections work on state by state level and nationwide. Brad, the state of Georgia has 159 counties, the second most counties of any state in the country behind only Texas. And Jocelyn has well over 1,000, I think nearly 2,000 election officials throughout the state. Am I right about that, Jocelyn?
1,600, yeah, just about 1,600.
So local election officials at not just the county level, but in localities and towns and cities that run elections, and being able to coordinate this network of election officials in the state can be such a challenge. And Brad, you hit on this. Then the pandemic hit. And I'll go to you, Jocelyn, because I was with you on March 10th, which was the day of the Michigan primary, which was going pretty smoothly, given what was happening. But that's the day I will always remember that the pandemic really hit home for me, and the challenge that comes not just from trying to respond to the pandemic, but to coordinate all of the election officials and educate your voters throughout your states. Can you talk a little bit about that, Jocelyn?
Yeah, I think I'll say two things. And one, yeah, our first statewide primary in this new era of new rights for voters was our presidential primary on March 10th. And it went exceedingly well. We had really, again, implemented all these ideas and proposals and perspectives that these experts we convened for the past year brought to the table. We had already implemented automatic voter registration. And we were able to achieve our goal that day of having things run smoothly with minimal lines, and also collecting data to inform our administration of the 3 subsequent elections we had in Michigan last year, including, of course, the November election. So we were ready to go, and the polls closed at 8 p.m. I did a press conference at 9 p.m. I think, David, to quote you, you said, "I can't believe this is your first statewide election," which I was quite proud of. That validation from one of our nation's elections experts. And then at 10 o'clock, I got a call from my chief of staff, came into the office and said that the governor's on the phone and she's about to go live with the first 2 coronavirus diagnoses in our state. And from then on, everything changed. And we immediately began preparing for a new normal. Really, a number of states, Arizona and Ohio included, had primaries the following week. We were able to observe what happened in those states, and in Georgia and in Wisconsin, immediately identifying the poll worker challenges that Brad was talking about and launching a statewide recruitment effort to recruit poll workers that ultimately recruited over 30,000 new election workers throughout the year and leading into November. And I think the big thing was that we recognized that everything was changing and that we had a responsibility to ensure that even in a time of great uncertainty, we were giving voters the clarity and the confidence that the elections would happen, that their votes would be counted, and they would have several secure options on how to vote. So we began building out these 3 pillars that guided our work. One is the infrastructure, making sure the election infrastructure was ready and investing in that. 2 was educating voters about that infrastructure so that they knew how to vote and had that certainty and clarity. And then 3rd was countering misinformation, which was really the biggest threat to election security that grew and escalated throughout the year. And those were the 3 pillars that guided us through the subsequent months as we made several different decisions to adapt and adjust all of our plans to run successful elections in the midst of a pandemic.
Yeah, so often people who don't live and breathe elections like the 3 of us think that election officials just show up on election day and put on an election, and they don't realize how election officials, and in particular, not just people like secretaries of state, but local election officials and their staff and volunteer poll workers are working, some cases 24/7, 365 days a year to get these things done, and you throw a pandemic into the mix. And Brad, I remember we were talking a lot during this time, and your primary was scheduled for later in March after Michigan's happened on March 10th. I still remember March 11th very clearly. I think that was the day that Rudy Gobert of the Utah Jazz got diagnosed as having COVID, and they started shutting down the NBA. And for those of us who are sports fans, it really started hitting home at that point as other sports leagues started following suit. But it had a huge impact on elections, especially as you're just a few days out from your primary. Can you walk us through a little bit about what happened during that time and what ended up happening with the primary and some of the challenges you saw?
Well, initially, we were a week and a half into the election. The General Assembly then was suspended operations. So Georgia shut down. And here we were about 2 weeks into our early voting. And so what do we do now? Do we continue to gut through it and finish it up no matter what? We made the decision, we'll push it out to the May 19th primary. And then later on, we said, we're still not ready to handle an election for the primary and moving the presidential primary, the balance of that into that May. So it got pushed out to June to give us a few more weeks to get ready. But that's when we realized that absentee voting would be a larger. We have no excuse absentee voting that's been in place since 2005. And then we sent out, the Secretary of State's office coordinated to send out absentee ballot applications to all active voters in the state of Georgia, about 7.5 million active voters. We sent them out the applications, and what that did, it took the burden off the counties because the counties had no staff to really handle all the applications. And what you would have had, instead of it being a uniform process with our office sending it out, you would have had all the parties, candidates, and other outside organizations. You could have gotten 5, 6, up to 10 different applications, which would have just swamped all the county's ability to really respond to those applications. So obviously we had a big improvement or larger turnout in the absentee ballot process. Then we also secured Rumbeck out of Arizona to mail the ballots out because they were used to doing a large volume. Instead of a onesie twosie or picking up a couple counties, we did a statewide for the June primary to make sure that we could really handle that. So the counties did the processing of the applications, and then Runbeck sent out the ballots, and it really worked well. A few counties did struggle just because they didn't have staff to handle those applications when they came in. And if they were emailed in, people were sending stuff in with TIFF files and all these the other, instead of just a PDF. And that messed up some of the counties that said, we can't read that. And so there was a few hiccups like that. But by and large, we got ready for the June primary. We kept all options open. So you had 3 weeks of early voting for the June primary, day of election on June, and then also obviously absentee voting.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I mean, there was so much uncertainty in Georgia during that time because that was really coinciding. I mean, in many ways, you know, states like Michigan had the good fortune of being able to complete their primary. I mean, the pandemic hit before the election day, but as you pointed out, Brad, voting had been going on for some time. So it was really in the middle of the election process that this was happening. And, you know, we were, you know, one of the things that struck me is as bad as the pandemic was and has been and continues to be, if, you know, in some ways from an election perspective, we might have been fortunate in the timing that it hit during the primary process, rather than if it had hit in, say, September, which would have been perhaps a total disaster. And I do wonder, there were so many things you were both doing in your states to make sure that you balanced access with integrity and confidence during this whole period of time. Both of your states joined the Electronic Registration Information Center, ERIC, and you mentioned that earlier, Jocelyn, which I helped lead the effort to create, which enables you to keep your voter lists more up to date. But you also, both your states reached out to 1 million eligible but unregistered voters and encouraged them to nearly 1 million to register through convenient, safe online voter registration, for instance, which was tremendous. What other things, you know, I think about the work that I know you both did as post-primary to get ready for, Jocelyn, you had an August primary, you then had we had a general election. Brad, you didn't know if you were going to have Senate runoffs at that time. But I remember the work you did on trying to battle the challenges that the pandemic was putting in front of you to find appropriate polling sites and to replace, you know, over 50% of your poll workers, many of whom were at risk because they were older. Jocelyn, why don't you start and you can talk a little bit about that. And Brad, I'd like to get your thoughts on that as well.
Well, yeah, I think we saw quite quickly, especially watching the experiences of other states. We saw, you know, long lines in Wisconsin, in part because they had to shut down precincts because they couldn't staff all the precincts. So we immediately saw that the personnel matter that was and that we and many others in customer service worlds were encountering and dealing with, and so at that moment there are a lot of other people asking, how can I help? And we actually, it was the idea to really launch this sort of very unprecedented statewide recruitment of new election workers began just a few days after that March 10th primary, when a local college baseball coach texted and said, our baseball season was just canceled. How can we help? And I said, can you work some elections? And then they wanted to ask other teams who are in a similar situation. So out of that conversation emerged the Democracy MVP program, which recognized that in a democracy, our election workers are on the front lines. They are, and we needed them for our May election. We needed to prepare for August and of course, November. And so we actually, began it through those sports partnerships that then evolved to partnering with the Pistons, that then evolved to the Pistons offering up their space and their facilities, that then led to State Farm Arena and many other basketball teams stepping up like the Atlanta Hawks and doing the same. And the whole thing just grew. LeBron James got involved in late June. So I say all that to say, that the heart of what we really experienced that manifested itself through so many 30,000 in our states stepping up to be election workers and filling that great need was that a successful election cycle and democracy really requires those partnerships, requires all of us working together and saying, how can I help? Particularly in moments like we were in this past year, but always. And in many ways, our ability to have a successful election throughout, actually 4 successful elections last year, was due in no small part to the thousands of people who stepped up to lend a hand and ensure every vote was counted and that the process was secure.
Yeah, Brad, I mean, Jocelyn's right. I mean, we know about the success of State Farm Arena in Atlanta, for instance, but I know you work closely not just with sports teams and the counties, but also, for instance, with corporate citizens and others to really to ensure that the needs of the pandemic, which required social distancing, which were going to require a lot more early and mail voting, were going to be that the voter was not going to feel those burdens placed upon them, that the voter was going to find themselves participating in a system that they found convenient and that they felt safe in. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things you did in Georgia?
Well, number one is probably poll worker recruitment. We needed to recruit more poll workers. Ended up recruiting 30,000 new poll workers, which was huge. Also, out of the blue, a couple of ladies were very interested in what could they do. So they formed an organization. It was really ad hoc, but they had leveraged their relationships with some major corporations. And so all of a sudden we had Home Depot, Coca-Cola, Delta, and UPS and other Georgia, icons reach out and say, okay, we can come with the plexiglass dividers. We can come with the mask. We can come with disinfectant wipes, things like that. Anheuser-Busch supplied a huge amount of disinfectant wipes for us. So it was just really a tremendous opportunity. And this was really this group of ladies that came, coming alongside of us in the counties to expand our ability to make sure that we had enough and appropriate personal protection equipment. Then we also started standing up some technology like Esri as a line management tool so we could see how long the lines were. We know that we made the national news in the June primary. If you read the headlines, you would have thought it was a disaster in Atlanta, but we have 159 counties. 139 counties in June had successful elections. But what I mean by that is they started at 7 a.m., finished at 7 p.m. Of the 20 other counties, 15 of those just had 1 or 2 precincts that extended out. But the other 5 did struggle. Fulton County was number 1. And so we needed new precincts, more equipment, deployed in the precincts, and we gave them tools to use so we could make sure that the counties had enough equipment for the number of registered voters that they could be expecting on election day. Then we stood up a line management tool to see how long are people standing in line. And then also, where were the tech workers, so we could make sure we could deploy a tech worker and get them there within 15 minutes if a tech issue arose during the day.
So let's fast forward now in the final 10 minutes or so that we have to election day, and we'll get to the aftermath of election day, but kind of the election day and the immediate aftermath, the counting of the votes and election and resulting of the results being reported out. How would you gauge your successes in the states from an objective perspective, as objective as we can be, in terms of knowing, like, eligible voters being able to cast a ballot, that the ballot was secure, that the results were accurate, and that all, because one thing I remember, this was one of the first presidential elections we've ever seen where we weren't talking about lines on election day. It's a huge success story. Brad, you're right. I mean, the stories after your primary, whether they're warranted or not, were about some sites that had long lines, and there were a few of them, but there was none of that on November 3rd and 4th. And that's not just in your states, but nationwide. Why don't we, I'll go to you, Jocelyn, first, and then to Brad. Talk a little bit about the success and what you saw in the immediate few days after election day.
Well, yeah, I think notably, as you mentioned, David, election day went extraordinarily smooth in Michigan and elsewhere. And we were in such a state at that moment, just a mode of adapt, adjust, anticipate, right? Or I guess I should say anticipate, adapt, and adjust. And we're constantly anticipating, constantly planning for every potential contingency, because so many contingencies had indeed emerged and come to bear on that in this cycle. And so, we predicted, quite closely the number of people would vote, the number of people who would vote absentee. We built a system and we just used data and math to make all of these predictions. And we built a system and an infrastructure to basically be prepared for that. And then we built an effort to protect that infrastructure, to educate voters about it and their options and bubble and all their, so they can have faith in it. But then we built an effort to protect that process from any potential efforts to undermine it leading up to the closure of the polls. And so our focus was very much on leading up to the closure of the polls. And I think we saw such a smooth election in part because of that, not just in Michigan, but in other states. And then notably, we were very, as you recall, hyper-focused in Michigan on the fact that we were anticipating 2/3 of our voters would vote absentee. Those ballots could not be counted as they were, mailed in, just like, many states do. Those ballots had to just basically sit in a secure place and couldn't even be processed until election day morning. And so we knew it was going to take a lot of time to process through and tabulate those 3.3 million absentee ballots. And we basically looked at the math, how many machines, how many people, how many ballots. And the math told us 80 hours, which would take us through Friday, which many similar states, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, also had that. And so then we knew that. And we knew that the space between when the polls closed and when we had the full unofficial tabulation of the ballots would be a space in which bad actors or nefarious actors would try to sow seeds of doubt or declare victory. And we're getting a lot of questions about that. What if a candidate declares victory on election night, even though not all the ballots will be counted? And so we knew that there was going to be some perhaps effort to undermine the process after the polls closed and up until when we had the unofficial results. And so we doubled, in some case tripled the number of machines and people and just tried to increase capacity behind the scenes, hoping to be finished sooner. And indeed we were finished within 24 hours of the polls closing Wednesday at 9 p.m. We were able to have the unofficial results at around 4:30. The day after the election was when the networks began declaring the winner in Michigan, the unofficial winner. And interestingly, a lot of unrest began at that time, but up until that point, it had been smooth. And then I'll just end by saying, notably after Friday, which was when all the other states had finished, and I think it was Friday or Saturday morning when the winner of the Electoral College was declared unofficially, then the escalation just continued, as we all know, and it just kept escalating in multiple different ways that we hadn't, quite frankly, been focused on or prepared for, although we were, mostly prepared. It was just the battlefronts emerged in lots of different ways. And I think that's why you saw such smoothness. We were really prepared for everything up to that point, but we hadn't to the same extent anticipated and invested in preparing for what would happen after a winner was declared. And again, that's where you saw a lot of challenges emerge.
Brad, I'm smiling a little bit because I'm just wondering, what if a candidate had declared victory on election night? We'll have to try to wrap our heads around that hypothetical. But Brad, I have thought many times after the election about the preparation that you and your team and the counties put into this election and making sure there were paper ballots that could be recounted and audited, that you had educated your voters, that you had educated and worked with your county election officials. The fact that you checked signatures on mail ballots multiple times, you brought the Georgia Bureau of Investigation in, that you counted the presidential ballots 3 times statewide, 3 different ways, once entirely by hand. I've often thought, what if that preparation had not gone into this process ahead of time? And can you talk a little bit about that and what the result was in, election day and in the days after the election, to make sure that from any objective, rational perspective, anyone could transparently see that the result was accurate?
On election day, for us, it went relatively smoothly. We had a few precincts open up late, but those were resolved by 9 o'clock, 9:30 at the latest. In the afternoon, our average wait time statewide was 2 minutes. And so we had defeated long lines. And so that was a tremendous accomplishment. But also then, as we got into the evening after the polls closed, it really started becoming apparent that the election was much closer than people expected. And then there were still many outstanding absentee ballots yet to be counted. And that's really when we started having our first inkling that this was probably going to end up, with the Democrat nominee prevailing over the Republican nominee, first time since 1992. But that's what we sort of understood late in the night. And one challenge that we had is a few counties in Georgia, we did pass a special state election board rule that you could begin the process of scanning your ballots 2 weeks earlier, but you shall 1 week before. So you weren't waiting days and days and days, but it became apparent that a few counties were a little lax in following that procedure. But be that as it may, about 2 to 3 days afterwards, we had most of the counties all buttoned up on their final vote totals, and it was really counting their absentee ballots. The challenge with that, though, when you have a very polarized time, very tight election, and you have that uncertainty, what it starts building is that distrust and the confidence that people have in the election results. And that's really what I think we're the number one thing that we're fighting today in Georgia and really nationwide, is restoring confidence in the election process.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. We live in a nation that is so narrowly divided in a partisan perspective, and yet there are people, and to be perfectly honest, they exist on both sides of the political spectrum, although they're a little more on the right side right now, who can't conceive of the idea that their candidate might lose in such a closely divided nation. And I think, a lot of us who've worked in elections know that, that if you look at your two states and the way that elections were conducted, everyone in your states had access to mail voting, early voting, election day voting very easily. Voter registration rates are very high in both of your states. Both your states do a very good job of making registration available to eligible voters. Everyone in your states has access to an auditable paper ballot, and those ballots were audited. And those processes aren't very different. In fact, they're almost identical to processes that we might see in states like Florida or Ohio or Iowa. And the only difference between your states and those other states are the margins are much closer. And that's obviously something that you don't have any control over. And that's, in fact, when the margins are so close, it's always struck me that the competence of the election officials we have to be particularly grateful for, because it is, whether it's if 10 or 11 or 12,000 votes or 150,000 votes, that's very different. We all think about Florida in 2000 with 537 votes and how narrow that margin is, and how closely kind of our confidence in our democracy hangs in the balance. I wanted to get, as we conclude, I wanted to ask you both, in the months after the election, I've talked to you both about this. You've both been public about this. You were among many election officials who received death threats, who had threats to yourselves, to your families, to your staff. You saw threats to local election officials, serious enough to warrant protection. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, and also anything that maybe, viewers of this don't know about what happened and what you saw, any stories you might want to share, because I really do. I look at you both with great admiration. I have never had to run an election. I certainly never had to run an election that the nation's eyes were all on, that had very narrow margins, where partisan tensions were high. You both did this. This is both of your first presidential elections in office. It's truly remarkable. So if you have any thoughts on kind of the personal pressures you saw, or any stories you have during that time, I'd love to hear it. Jocelyn, you want to start?
Yeah, I think that there was a lot of camaraderie between the secretaries like Brad and Barbara Sagafsky in Nevada, and Katie Hobbs and I, and Kathy Bookfar in Pennsylvania, just who are dealing with a lot of the same things on these websites that, with our personal information posted so that people could show up at our homes, and lots of threats and all the rest. I think there's the thing I'll say is that there were many threats and many incidents that were not reported intentionally. So I was never comfortable with them being reported at all, because you're just trying to protect family, self, democracy. You're in protection mode. And the more it's out there that these threats are happening, the more people get ideas. and the more copycat there's more uncertainty emerges. And so I think I was really both uncomfortable and also did not anticipate the amount of attention about the threats that occurred, particularly as people showed up at my home, and it was actually, I remember when I was quite disappointed to know that the news was about to cover it the day after, and then had to put out a statement, and then that statement became a bigger issue. And so I think when you're going through that, you certainly, the attention is not something that helps the situation from my standpoint, because you're mostly you don't want other people to get ideas. And indeed that is what happened, and that did need to lead to greater security. And of course, everything was escalating at that point up until what we saw January 6th. But the other thing I'll just add is that it was very clear to me at that moment on a Saturday night, where I'm trying to, give my 4-year-old a bath, and so that the water drowns out the voices outside my home so that he doesn't hear them and get scared, and finding all other different ways to kind of make sure he doesn't hear the increasingly loud bullhorn outside of my house yelling things like, you're a murderer and all these crazy things. In that moment, it was very clear to me, and I felt very connected to not just my colleagues around the country who are dealing with similar things, not just my colleagues in Michigan who are dealing with similar things like our governor, but the people who come before us, who stood on a bridge in Selma, Alabama, facing down state troopers simply so that people could have a right to vote, and that this is the work. Protecting democracy requires not just vigilance, but a willingness to stand up against those threats, because that's what we've seen occur since the inception of our democracy. And so, once for me, my thinking shifted to, these folks aren't attacking me, they're attacking democracy, they're attacking our voters and the will that our voters articulated unequivocally at the polls. My protection mode went into simply protecting them, and my focus shifted not just to protecting my family, but also to protecting voters' confidence in the system, and that they knew no matter what attacks, and many continued and many preceded that moment outside my home, no matter what attacks were levied at me, their vote was going to be secured, their voice was going to be heard, and I would stand guard to protect that system no matter what. And so, focusing on that, focusing outwardly and saying, don't worry, everyone, democracy will prevail, and instilling that confidence in everyone else was how I, dealt with all of those things that, again, didn't begin and didn't end that night that people gathered outside my home.
Brad, how about you? I mean, you've been so stoic in the face of these threats, and very, you've been very focused on doing your job. Do you have any thoughts about the things you experienced, or any story that perhaps you haven't shared yet?
I think it's pretty much out there. People know that we had threats. I said this to a news reporter once. I knew that she was on the left side of the aisle, but what bothers me about this is I always thought that our side, we're the ones that wore the white hats. Now, I know if you're on the other side of the aisle, y'all think you're wearing the white hats, and we wear the black hats. I get that. But you always thought that, we could expect to have noble behavior, from our side. We talk about the Constitution, we talk about the founders, we talk about patriots. Well, then what we're really talking about then is George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Adams, the people that wrote the Constitution, Lincoln. But for us, our most recent person is Abraham Lincoln. And it's interesting, in 1981, when he took the reins of the presidency, he talked about how for 200 and some odd years, we've had that peaceful transfer of power. And the rest of the world looked at us as the icon. This is how you run a democratic establishment. It's America that sets the mark for the rest of the world. And we did set a mark this past time, and it was a black mark. And it's something that I think we all have to come together and work on and say, no, we will have a peaceful transfer of power, that we will have hard-won elections. We will make sure it's honest voting. And that's why, at the end of the day, we fought hard to make sure that we secured the vote and that we walked that line of integrity. And people have to understand that the voting really gets tabulated at the county level. And as long as you have personal integrity at the county level, we have 159 counties, then the election system is secure. And that's what we had in Georgia. I didn't like the results as a Republican, but those were the results. And we fought hard to make sure that those were the results that were then certified.
Yeah, Jocelyn mentioned the secretaries that were talking with each other and supporting each other, and what might not have been clear if you're not familiar with the secretaries, that they were a mix of Republicans and Democrats. They did not all vote for the same person for president or other offices, but they were all shared a commitment to a greater goal, which is to preserving and facilitating American democracy. It's one of the reasons I admire you both so much. I think about at the county level. There were election officials like Tina Barton, a Republican in your state of Michigan, Jocelyn, and Adrian Fontes, a Democrat in the Phoenix area in Maricopa County. Election officials who were elected and were on the ballot, who stood up for the integrity of the election in which they both lost. And that kind of integrity, there were thousands, perhaps millions of heroes who helped save our democracy this last time around. We won't know many of their names, but I'm glad we know both of your names, and can thank you for that work. And voters in your state should be really grateful for all the work that you and your staffs and all of the local election officials have done. I think with that, we'll wrap it up. I've been very grateful for this time. I want to also thank the 92nd Street Y for the opportunity to have this conversation. It's a great opportunity to talk about some of these things, and hopefully we're on the path that you've both set for us for voter confidence, election integrity, and access for all eligible voters. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.